I'm going to talk to you about a small project I have ongoing in Luxembourg and its greater region. I'm going to start by providing a little background into why I thought this project was necessary, to give some literature context, and then talk you through how we set up the project and some of our early findings from the data that we've collected and the thoughts. So basically, geography has a long history in research in spatial interactions. And this involves the representation and simulation of flows of activity or material between locations. And this can be as routine or occasional interactions. And these kind of interactions of activity, they are really essential to how we explore urban and regional dynamics. And they include things like our everyday routine about travel to work, school, and our shopping habits, etc., etc. And also our social life is central to these flows of activity. They manifest through these series of flows and dynamics and interactions, and how we ascribe meaning and form attachments to place. So that's one point. Likewise, there are many mathematical models that exist in order to model these spatial interactions. And most of them depend on this notion of gravitational force and forces of attraction and central place theorem. But actually what we've seen and what we've observed is that during the COVID-19 pandemic, our habits, behaviors, practices, policies around social spatial interactions have been completely turned upside down. So what does this mean for modeling in a pandemic time? So this led me to the development of the following research question. How can we explore, evaluate, and understand spatial interactions during the pandemic? And why are we using a community-based citizen science approach? Because actually we want to understand the perceptions and relationships and experiences that people have to places, and understand how those experiences, relationships, and reflections on place have changed during the pandemic. This cannot be done with big data. You cannot understand what people are thinking and what people are reflecting on using big mobility data sets. So we want a more nuanced and more personal approach to understand this experience. We're coming from the perspective of collaborative mapping. It's an excellent framework to start exploring this type of research question, because we want to understand the experiences of places, and collaborative mapping allows us to capture and articulate and visualize those experiences of place that are very personal to each one of us. And we use this type of collaborative mapping has really grown from the theory of public participation GIS and PPGIS, and what is now has emerged as citizen science, where we really engage citizens in the scientific process. So what we have been trying to do in this project is to engage citizens in the process of data collection, and also to some extent in the process of data analysis. But we're at the very beginning of this journey. So I developed with the help of an NGO out of London called Mapping for Change. We used their mapping platform and adapted that for our needs to develop a kind of local citizens observatory for exploring and developing collaborative maps. Our first project within this observatory is to explore our changing perceptions in urban environments and suburban environments and rural places in the time of COVID and social distancing. So we have our case study area is the greater region, is Luxembourg, which is here in the center, and its greater region. It's very, very different to to the UK, where I'm from originally. It's a very small country. Most people, they pass through it. They may stop to fill up petrol and buy alcohol. It has a very small population of 620,000 people, 50% of whom have a migrant background like myself. It's a multilingual environment, which makes it a big challenge to do any kind of participatory research, because it has 3 official languages, and more English is becoming a dominant language, although not an official language, because it's the most common second language of the residents and the community. It has another interesting phenomena in that more than 185,000 frontalier people who work in Belgium, Germany, and France, commute every day into the borders, which creates huge problems for air pollution, traffic, congestion. And on the same vein, Luxembourgers love their cars. So just to give you some context of the country, it's a very different scale at which we work at than what is commonplace in the UK. The research method, at the moment, we're focusing on Luxembourg and the greater region. We have an interface that is multilingual in French and English, but participants are permitted to contribute data in whatever language they choose. And then we use DeepL and Google Translate to do a rough translation. It is something else if we have a significant number of contributions that we could also ask citizens to engage in the research to do translation. We co-designed a set of questions that we expect to trigger reflection on this topic. We have 9 so far. We want to understand the changes people have seen in the built environment and the natural environment. What signs of COVID and social distancing? So how has that changed? Places we went to, places of play, where we feel relaxed, where we feel nervous, where have you stopped going to, and where we have changed our behaviour. So for instance, I've stopped using the bus, I'm going on the bike now. It's really key to understand, I think, at this point, Luxembourg only had 1 official phase of Blijf doorheen, which means stay at home, unlike other countries and also the countries surrounding us. The lockdown was this time last year, and since we've been on restrictive measures, but our economic policies are very liberal, our lockdown policies have been quite liberal in comparison to other neighbouring countries and what you yourselves have experienced in the UK. So let's take a look. The collaborative map is essentially a very simple mapping interface where you can click on it, you add your contribution, you select what category you want to share your thoughts upon, and then you're asked a series of questions that kind of tease out a more nuanced thought in this process. We did have a moderation, so each contribution that is made goes to a moderator, just to be sure that there's no profanities being used, etc. But I have actually turned that off because it was a barrier to contributions we found during mapping sessions. How did we collect data? We used 7 online mapping sessions. I'm actually doing one next week in the UK to get a very different perspective. So far, I have a total of 156 contributions, which for a small qualitative collaborative project seems to be a reasonable start. We have done one collaborative mapping session, which has also included citizens analysis. So they've looked at the contributions that have been shared, and they've gone in some way to analyze what themes they've seen in the data set. We've also complemented that with open axial coding of contributions that combines the contributed themes of the citizens with the researchers' own analysis. And also, because I have a very interesting background in quantitative and qualitative geography, I'm also integrating text analysis tools that come from the field of digital humanities. So let's have a quick look at the analysis. Places where people went, well, it won't come as a surprise that during the official phase of confinement, more than 50 reflections that were shared, people sought out places that were either essential places, which our citizens called useful places, or they were places where people were seeking out peace. And these places tended to have an environmental connection or a heritage connection. But they were also looking for new places to discover or to refamiliarize themselves with places that they haven't visited in a long time. So just to be clear, during the Blijf doorheen policy, we were allowed out to exercise. And this also meant that we could go in the car to exercise. So as long as you were going out to exercise, you could go further than your local neighborhood. So within this data set, we saw the role of green space and nature. Another thing to remember is in at least in this part of Europe, apartment life is very common. People have small balconies, living in apartment blocks, but do not have access often to gardens. So the role of green space and nature became really an important thing for them. I just going to, do you also see the images here so you can't see the text? Okay, so some of the thoughts that said is that the forest and nature brings some change and calmness. So they're looking for something to take them out of their mundanity, routine of staying at home, and looking for a space of calm. It's peaceful, it's quiet, without many people. And another contribution, which I think is interesting, is it brought me a feeling of peace and hope. So it really reinforces the importance of green space and nature during this time, as it really brings some kind of respite. And so the other thing that came out in the contributions was the role of open access heritage sites. When I say open access, I mean heritage sites that are not fenced off. So they are accessible to all, even if you can't go inside. And what this brought to our participants is a sense of discovery or a sense of rediscovery. So in this particular instance here, it is an old Celtic wall, one of the biggest in Europe. We discovered it in the first confinement. So they said they discovered it. They are exploring something new. And this gives them a sense of discovery. Another one is a sense of rediscovery. It's a long time I was not there. I think the most beautiful castle in Luxembourg. So they're finding beauty, they're having a sense of rediscovery, and they are having an experience that takes them from the mundanity of life in confinement. What impact do these spaces have on people? It's not a surprise that green space encourage people to feel relaxed, calm, safe, and happy. And you find all of these terms co-locating with each other so that they were being used together in sentences repeatedly within the contributions. 15 minutes, okay. So where did people feel nervous? They felt nervous in green space, inside buildings, and within the public realm and on public transport. So 21 contributions were made in this category. And it was actually, interestingly, it's the co-presence of others that made people feel nervous. So when we think about the vitality and vibrancy of our public spaces and the public realm, we normally want a great deal of co-presence, people to be around each other, to have this sense of busyness. But actually, in the time of the pandemic, this co-presence really impacted how people were feeling in a negative way. And I'll just demonstrate that. So we saw also a concern with the environment. We have a new form of trash, rubbish that's occurring. And also the co-presence of others made people feel uneasy because they felt or they perceived that social distancing rules could not be conformed to. So here we have the policies of the government and impacting how we are perceiving space. So we perceive space, lost my train of thought. We had 20 contributions about how nervous people felt in the environment, and it was particularly evident that inside buildings were where people felt uncomfortable and experienced this sense of nervousness, which is not a surprise given the scientific evidence of the risk of being inside buildings. We also saw that this risk, the perception of risk and the fear of risk was exacerbated by the numbers. So if the numbers were going up, then people would feel more nervous. And it was also connected to their personal experience. Following confinement, people felt relaxed. I was quite enjoyed to see the museum and the Greenspace appear in this context. Behaviour changes. We observed many different behaviour changes. In fact, it was very difficult to see a pattern in how people felt about the changes that they saw in their built environment. And the most frequently occurring feeling was sadness by the lack of people. So people really felt a sadness in how the towns, the built environment, the experience of place had changed because now there is a lack of people present. There was a breadth of reflections on the changes. I just thought this was interesting because one participant felt that they felt less pressure. They had a freedom from their everyday because they didn't have to worry about their clothing expenses and their appearances. So what might all this mean? Well, we have anxiety and stress from the co-presence of others. So how does one design places to reduce anxiety and stress in pandemics caused by being in the proximity of others? So we have a question here that we need to answer. We have a sense of space and distance that was considered to be important to our participants. So to obtain respite from the virus, people needed to feel a sense of space and distance. How do you do that in our dense urban spaces? So what challenges does this present for modern urban planning if we want to create cities that are resilient for future pandemics? It's not a surprise that green space brings respite. We know that. It's well documented in the literature. But should urban planning, construction projects and the like still continue when they are causing disruption to green space that is such a powerful, positive variable in people's lives during this period? What does this mean for urban planning? In Luxembourg, green space means green roofs. So how do we integrate good quality green space in urban planning that actually brings respite, relaxation and calmness to people? Should it really be in the form of a green roof, or should we have more imaginative or not imaginative ways to incorporate green space in our cities and urban environments? We also saw the importance of cultural heritage and the arts, an area that has really suffered under the pandemic. But for our contributors, it emerged as an important benefit in providing a positive experience during this period. We have also this debate about right of access to nature versus the rights of nature. We have all seen, we've all been encouraged to walk, encouraged to go out, encouraged to explore, because we have been restricted. We are not able to go on holidays. So we've been discovering more locally. But what does that mean on our local environments? What does that mean on the rights of nature to have a healthy ecosystem and the right to exist, persist, maintain, and regenerate its vital cycles if we continue to disregard these rights because we need the feeling of escape? Perhaps this indicates that our current cities and places where we are residing are not fit for purpose. They do not support the quality of life that we are all searching for during this pandemic. Also, we have seen and observed that the pandemic challenges and disrupts how we form attachments to places and how we form connections to places. But I won't go into details because I'm over time. So in conclusion, we can reveal that there are hidden and unintended consequences of the epidemic control decisions. We know that the meanings we ascribe to places are fluid, and this fluidity has been further impacted by the pandemic. What we don't know is the temporality of these new meanings that we have ascribed to places and the attachments that we have formed. We also understand that the urban design concept of co-presence does not stand true in the time of pandemic, but what does that mean in the mid to long term for urban planning? And we also know that positive spatial interactions during the pandemic are determined by how successfully our needs are met, our needs for open space, our sense of safety and escape, our search for respite, and our need to avoid other people, as well as our desire for culture, because it adds benefits. So finally, I'd like to say thank you. And for any of you listening that are interested in citizen science and health, then please take a look at the PhD if you have some master's students that could be interested. The deadline's next Monday. Thank you.
We've had one so far from Labu. Really interesting findings. Thank you very much for the presentation. Did you also consider, do people have access, well, at least to private gardens, which you've touched on already, but also green views from the window? And then he also asks, do you think about how far people went? Were they visiting Greenspace close to home or further away?
Okay, so private gardens, I think community allotments were, I have to check the public policy. I'm not sure they were accessible during confinement, and they're small. In the suburbs, green space is not a problem as you go out of the city. Most people have gardens. It's really an artifact of the urban life here. Further places, it's a difficult concept in Luxembourg because you can drive 5 minutes and you can be in the forest. So again, I think when lockdown was finished and we had more freedom, but still restricted across Europe, people went further afield in Luxembourg. Yeah, and I would like to actually look at some of these work with some of the tourist agencies to look at these numbers to complement this, but I don't have, this is the beginning of that, but yes.
Of course.
Green views, that's really interesting. I might get my students to do view sheds.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. That sounds like a really good idea. I like that. There's been a little bit on view sheds in the UK for green space, but it would be so interesting to see how that varies as well. We have another question from Lena. Thank you very much for the talk. Lots of food for thought. You mentioned in the beginning you were planning to hold a workshop in the UK. Do you expect to find similar or very different patterns here?
I would imagine different, because you have different policies. For example, the workshop that I'm going to do, it's with a group of elderly people in Wales. I've connected through my father. And I would imagine that Wales has had very tight restrictions on where you can go. So also then your ability to engage in physical exercise becomes an important part of that. And so I would expect different patterns. I would expect different patterns if I was to explore a coastal town. Mm-hmm. Also, I would expect, what I haven't done yet is engage with any teenagers, because I think that they've had a very different experience than the participants I've worked with so far. But if any of you are interested and would like me to hold a workshop for your students, just drop me an email. I'm always happy.
Great. No, if you could share your email in the chat at some point later in the session, that would be great. And someone's asked to share the PhD details as well, so if you could pop those in the chat.
Yeah. Okay.
During the next talk would be fine. I have one other question that kind of builds on what we just said, and that was who filled in the survey. So do you have any kind of views on that?
It's not really a survey. It's a kind of, it's sort of a survey, but it's not a survey. I know because I've organized the mapping sessions, so I know the different groups of people, and I try to keep a log of the number of participants, but I haven't specifically asked ages or genders, because it's not essential to my I think to answering this question. Likewise, it could have been interesting to know where the participants lived, because we have a phenomenon now where the border countries are in lockdown, but if you live 10 kilometers of the Luxembourgish border, you can travel over. So we have a lot of people coming to experiencing Luxembourg because they can't experience their own neighborhoods. So it would be nice to know if they are frontaliers or residents. But again, if you ask too many questions, it puts people off and they don't want to contribute. And also, it's not a quantitative survey. So it would be very difficult to find generalizations. These are just, in this kind of cross